Hello and a good morning from Connecticut. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to our monthly Window On program, which is our monthly virtual panel on hot topics in economy, policy, business, society, and all related to that. Of course, not surprisingly, today's window, of course, is on COVID-19, which is the most important topic that all of us are engaged with in our daily personal as well as business lives. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all safe with you and your family and your loved ones, and we wish you all the best in this difficult period that is going to be ahead of us. First of all, you've seen some of the guidelines in the video. In addition to that, some of you are eligible for CPE credits. If you are, then just be reminded that you need to type your full name and email address in the space provided. You have to click OK for free pop-ups that occur during the program. Stay online for the entire webcast. And credit, of course, is only available if you're participating live in this webcast. Also, don't forget to put in questions if you have any of those. We'll have a lot of people. We're over 200 people now on our webcast, so we'll probably not be able to answer all the questions, but we'll try to put in as many as possible during the conversation. This is our second panel on COVID-19 crisis. A month ago, in our previous session on February 25th, we had an excellent panel, but that was primarily focused on China, because almost all the outbreaks up to that point were in China or just beginning to spread across Asia. We saw some early signs of that. We did identify the risks of a global pandemic and the need for rapid containment. But then, of course, since that time, the situation has very rapidly turned for the worse, as you can see from this slide from Johns Hopkins University, which is just additional new cases that are coming up every day, and really shows why on March 11th, the WHO, and you can just see it, called this a global pandemic. You can see on the chart that was exactly the time that we saw a rapid escalation in the number of new cases. Now, of course, you're all bombarded by the amount of concerning news about the outbreak, and apparently still have hunger to hear more about this. And what we will try to do in this webcast today is to really learn from 4 practitioners who are coming from very different backgrounds, from medicine and technology, from economics, from business, and from policy and strategy, to connect some of the dots on how to approach this crisis from different perspectives. I'm really honored to introduce those 4 panelists. First of all, we're going to start with a discussion on the crisis itself, the emergence of the crisis, where is this heading, what are the critical inflection points in this crisis. And for that, we are being joined by Dr. Joel Klein, MD. Joel is the Interim Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at the University of Maryland Medical System, an expert in the role of technology in medicine, also a former president of emergency medicine practice, and a medical director of informatics at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, Washington Center. Joel, welcome, and thank you for joining us in this webcast.
Thank you.
In our second segment, we're going to talk about the global and the U.S. economic impacts. How is this pandemic beginning to impact on the economy? What do we understand? And very importantly, what are the possible trajectories on what the recovery may look like? And for that, we're being joined by Catherine Mann. Catherine is the Global Chief Economist at Citibank. Before that, she was Chief Economist at the OECD. She held the Richard M. Rosenberg Professor of Global Finance at the International Business School at Brandeis University, a long-standing friend of the Conference Board. Thank you very much for joining us in your busy times, Catherine.
Happy to be with you.
Then, in the third part of the meeting, we're going to move to the business response on what this is doing, what are the implications for business, how do businesses cope with these type of crises, how do they prepare for worse to come, what are the to-dos and what are the not to-dos. And for that, we are joined by our own CEO of the Conference Board, Steve Odland. Steve has a long-standing career as a business leader, leading many companies and major business units, including being CEO of AutoZone and Office Depot, as well as Stops Markets, and dealt with a few crises. And I'm sure this is a unique crisis, but also an opportunity to look at your past experiences. Welcome, Steve.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Bart.
And then finally, we will turn to some of the bigger political and governance implications on how governments are managing this crisis, and how they are dealing with the dilemmas that are facing in this crisis. And for that, we're being joined by Nick Redman. Nick is the Director of Analysis and Editor-in-Chief of Oxford Analytica. Formerly to that, he was the Director of Editorial at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, as well as working before at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Nick, thank you for joining us and helping us our partnership with Oxford Analytica to continue.
Thank you, Bart. It's my pleasure to join you, and greetings from the epicenter.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's go right into the first segment on the evolution of the crisis. And for that, of course, as always, have a few poll questions. So I will ask my colleagues of the web team to put up the first poll question, which really is on what your expectation is that the COVID pandemic will globally begin to do. So we will see, how confident are you that there will be a decline in new daily cases? Do you expect that the decline in new daily cases, so it's the escalation that I talked about before, that we will begin to see that globally to decline by the end of April, that you think that is closer to the beginning of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, so that will be around late June, that will not happen before the second half of 2020, that it will drop before the summer but then return during the fall, or that you really don't know? So give you a little bit of chance to respond to this. What is your best guess at the moment of where we begin to see the peak in new daily cases globally being added to the current number of cases? And we're close to closing the call. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll be closing it. So what we're seeing is that about 33%, about 1/3 of you think this is going to be closer to the summer, like late June, before we're beginning to see this. Then the second most important response is that there will be a drop before the summer, but we'll see a return during the fall. And then there's a bit of a split between by the end of April versus not before the second half of 2020. So really a little bit all over the place. That I think shows the fact that we're all trying to make our best guess. Let me ask our panel members very quickly, 30 seconds, your first response. Are you surprised? Had you expected something else? Catherine, let me start with you.
Well, I think the fact that we are so uncertain amongst ourselves about what the trajectory of the epidemiology is going to look like, we shouldn't be at all surprised at the financial markets whipsawing around, because not only are they uncertain about fiscal policy response, but they don't even know what fiscal policy is responding to. And so, in some sense, what we're seeing reflected in that poll, we see reflected in the stock markets every day.
Right. Steve, your first response.
Well, it looks like more than half say that, or hope that this will happen and will peak before summer. That kind of syncs with the conference board's analysis and your analysis, Bart. And then there's the question of whether it's going to be bimodal and it'll come back, which of course we didn't ask here. But I think this is probably the assumption that most business leaders are using for their planning purposes.
Yeah. Nick, your first reaction to those poll results?
Well, there's a fair amount of optimism about for those first two options there. I think it's just so difficult to say if this really takes hold in some of the more densely populated, less developed countries. It could really rip on for quite a long time.
Right. So, Joe, let me go to you, and folks, we can close the poll right now, but let me sort of have your reaction to this, but really then sort of broaden this a little bit about what have scientists really learned now the past couple of weeks since this event has occurred. What do we know for sure that might happen, and what do we know for sure will not happen, if we know anything for sure?
Right. So I guess the first thing I would say is I'm not surprised at all by the variety of opinions that our audience has on what comes next, what do the next few months look like. I think if you polled a whole bunch of medical professionals, you would get something that looks very similar to that. There's really much more that we don't know than we do know now. I think some of the things that are clear, like the importance of social distancing and hand washing and those kinds of things, those are obviously critical. And the extent to which segments of the world and different populations do or do not adopt and then persevere in those measures are going to drive a lot of how this plays out for sure. I think in terms of what have we learned from a scientific point of view about this, I would point to three things. The first is we're starting as doctors to get more comfortable with what this test for the disease really means. It's looking more and more like if you get COVID-19 and then you are tested every single day during your illness, your test will not be positive every single day, which means that the sensitivity of this test is less than perfect. And how less than perfect, we don't know, because we don't have enough tests, at least in the United States, to do a large-scale study to really figure this out. What it does mean is that if you get tested and it's negative, that doesn't mean you don't have the disease. And that has a whole lot of implications for what we tell patients, how we take care of patients. It's also clear that there's a pretty high rate of co-infection. We don't know what that rate is, but it's somewhere between 5 and maybe as high as 15%. What that means is that if we test you, for example, for something like influenza or strep throat and it's positive, you can't just say, well, you know, Occam's razor, you probably just have that and we're all done here. That's not the case. We've seen a number of patients in my organization, certainly, where that's been positive and then they get retested a few days later for COVID-19 and sure enough, that's what it is. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think we're starting to understand the natural history of this disease, and what that means in English is, you know, what is the typical course of the disease? What does it look like clinically? So for many people, they're completely asymptomatic. For other people, it feels like a cold. For still other people, probably the smallest group, it's profound hypoxia, which means you need oxygen in order to survive. And the degree to which you need oxygen really dictates, and for how long you need it really dictates your outcome. There are a number of patients who seem to need oxygen for a number of weeks even as they transition to full recovery. And the other key feature of the natural history that we've learned is that there is some subset of patients who look like they're getting better and then they suddenly drop off a cliff and deteriorate rapidly. So understanding that lets us anticipate as doctors what an individual patient is going to do, and it also lets us start to plan macroscopically within the healthcare system. And then I think the final thing is we're understanding more and more about the transmissibility of this disease. It is now clear that you can, with no symptoms, transmit this thing for days prior to ever developing symptoms yourself. And that's a pretty strong argument for staying in your house, staying away from other people. The more social distancing we can encourage, the less we run the risk that you're going to come into contact with a currently asymptomatic person. So I would say from my perspective as a clinician, those would be three of the most striking things.
That's a great summary. Thank you. Before we open up for panelists to make a few additional comments, I wanted to ask you, it's very important for business people to understand what is the inflection point. There are so many numbers out there. I showed you a number of new cases, for example. What do we need to look at if you're a business leader and say, you know, when can I begin to sort of open up my business? You know, what are the important numbers that I should begin to track to get a little bit more understanding of that?
Right. So what we've heard some people say is that it's the number of new cases. Now, the problem with that is we don't really know what the denominator is because testing is so far from perfect, at least in the United States. So in other words, if the number of new cases goes down, that could simply reflect the lack of access to testing. In my opinion, one of the most important things to watch is simply the volume of people coming to our hospitals. So if we assume that by this time a couple weeks from now, I don't know, 50%, 60%, 70% of the care that's going on in our hospitals is related to this disease, and then we start to see that go down definitively, I think that will be an important piece of evidence that things perhaps have started to turn for the better. But what that means economically and from a public policy point of view, I think is a very different question.
Right. Finally, and then I'm really going to open it to the person, but I just want to pick up this one question that just came on. Under what circumstances should a person be tested? Are there certain criteria for who and when testing should occur?
So that's a great question. It's a very understandable question. We get that question from our employees. We get it from patients. We get it from neighbors. And the simple answer is that the answer seems to be changing almost every day, both as we understand the disease better, as our health system is progressively saturated with these patients, and as our ability to test patients changes. So what I'm saying is there's no perfect answer, and whatever I tell you, it's probably going to be different, within a day or two. But at a high level, what we are telling our community is if you are not short of breath, if you do not feel like, hey, I need to be in the hospital, then what we would encourage you to do if you're having symptoms of an upper respiratory infection is just assume you have it. You don't need the test. Just stay home, stay away from other people. If you are sick enough to be in the hospital, then you will most likely be tested when you come to the hospital to get care. The final category of person has to do with healthcare workers. And this has to do with trying to segment out people that we really need to take out of the front lines of caring for patients. The problem is we're learning that the test is imperfect, and we're learning that we need all the healthcare workers we can get. I heard a New York City emergency physician this morning advocating that if you don't have symptoms and you've been working in an ER continuously, just keep working. Don't worry about it. Don't get tested.
Okay. So let's open up to the panel, and I'm going to just let any of you react. But there's one question out there which I hope one of you will pick up, and that question is how can we accelerate production of ventilators and PPE equipment more than we're doing right now? Is there any one of you who has some wisdom on that?
Well, I did receive a congressional briefing the other night, and I was told that, first of all, ventilators and respirators are being brought from the national stockpile, which was set aside for the military. They've opened that up, and they're rushing all that supply forward. They separately have opened up a secondary supply chain and approved manufacturers that are in other parts of the world, including in Holland, for those products. And then finally, they have added lines of production to other medical manufacturers in the United States who didn't previously produce those kinds of products but produced other kinds of products. And so the view, at least from Congress, and what I'm being told, is that that it's now a matter of getting them to the right places, but the quantity soon will be adequate.
Yeah, I want to bring in sort of a maybe a little bit more pessimistic view, not with regard to the ability of industry to produce, but to the extent that some of these products are produced abroad. The most recent view of nationalism and deglobalization, bring everything home for production. This is a global phenomenon. Everybody around the world is looking for more masks, for more ventilators, and so the tendency to hunker down and protect your own is, I think, very real. It's natural, but it also means that there's an awful lot of opportunity for, rather than we're all in this together, let's beat it, there's a zero-sum game attitude, which I think we do see in some sense. There's also a variety of these products that were available early on, especially testing kits, for example, that were available early on, that they were not U.S. made, and therefore they were deemed to be not acceptable for U.S. use. That I think put us behind in terms of testing. So there is this sort of interplay between the politics and economics of trade policy and what and nationalism and political issues as well, that stand in the way of an effective treatment of the testing and treatment of the disease. And as I say, we're, from a global perspective, we are all in this together, and we will not beat it unless we do it collectively.
Joel, there's one question here, and then I think we'll move on to the global and the economic impacts. But the one question is this issue of any evidence that we have on this virus returning, right? So there's this whole debate now, oh yes, we may get over this before the summer, or at least we'll be able to sort of limit the impact, but then it may be coming back in the fall, and how big is this impact going to be? There's this whole discussion about herd immunity that might then perhaps help a little bit in order to have the effects less. What do we know really at this point on this, and how seriously should companies think about that scenario?
Yeah, I wish I could give you an answer. I think there are people who are virology experts who might have some theoretical reasons to believe that this pandemic will resurge or will not resurge in the fall. But if I were trying, as we think about our own business, so we're a 26,000 person company here in Baltimore, so we're in that sense in the same boat as many, many, many other organizations. I think what we're trying to do is just think about being resilient generally, leaving open the possibility that, yes, that could happen. I will tell you we have rescheduled a large number of significant capital projects to the fall with the full understanding that we may have to push them yet again. But the absence of perfect information, I think, hasn't stopped us from trying to plan. All kinds of things could change between now and then. It's possible that the ingenuity of the world could have a vaccine by then. It's just not clear.
We just need to track it very closely. Okay, let's move on to the second section and talk about the economic effects. And in fact, some questions are already coming in, Catherine. Somebody asking, what about current view on the severity and the pace of recession and recovery in the U.S. and globally? What are the factors to monitor? This is really hard to do when you're in the middle of the events happening. I think you and I are both experiencing that. What is unprecedented here? What is really complicating the economist analysis now in order to begin to sort of sort out what the impacts of this crisis could be?
So there are a lot of challenges, and it's very much a moving target, and that's why we think it's really important to have a framework for assessing the incoming data. And I think the one benefit that we have on this is that we do have data coming in from China, sort of the first wave of implications for different parts of the economy, and that can help us understand what data to be looking at, and also frame the potential consequences for other parts of the global economy and other countries going forward. So this framework for analysis that we have put into place, and we use this on both a bottom-up country-by-country economist level, but also in a top-down sense implemented in a macroeconomic model with a lot of spillover. We have 4 components to this framework. One is to look at the consequences for consumption of restrictions on social activity. And we're parameterizing that at this point with different kinds of restrictions that are showing up in terms of travel and tourism. These are very big chunks of consumer activity. They are reflective of hotels and restaurants. And we already know to some degree about how much of a restriction has been put into place. When we talk about no allowances of cross-border travel, the collapse of airline travel, and also the restrictions on domestic coming from lockdown or shelter-in-place policies at the domestic level, which is now quite pervasive across the whole world. So the first shock we can talk about in terms of consumption, social activity, and its implications for, in particular, services. And we can look at services PMI, we can look at services manifestation, restaurants, and so forth. The second shock is business investment, and we already know that a downturn in growth is going to be a damper on business investment going forward. But we also have found in our research that uncertainty is a very important and separate component that dampens business investment. And so when we think about shocks to implement into a macroeconomic model or to look at data for implications for growth going forward, we look at both the spillover effects on the demand side, but also measures of uncertainty. We look at a couple of different high-frequency measures. The third shock that we think about is the shock to the financial markets. And of course, we can see that played out in a number of different markets, the equity markets and VIX in particular, but also on credit spreads and sort of dislocations in the credit markets and in the bond markets and that sort of thing. What we found in our research is that the 2 major drivers of financial conditions are equity markets and VIX, even though these other markets are important. The most important drivers are equity markets and VIX. And then we also have models of how financial conditions feed back to affect consumer behavior and business behavior. And then, of course, the fourth shock that we hardly even talk about, it seems these days, even though in another time it would be absolutely front-page news, and that is the complete disarray, historic changes in the energy markets. This remarkable change in what's expectations for price structure in the energy markets. And that, of course, has important implications for different parts of the world. So we look at these four shocks. This is our framework for analysis. And this framework allows us to look at a lot of data coming in from countries and to gauge just how important is the social distancing for consumer behavior. If it's not too important, well then maybe you don't need much fiscal policy. Although what we've done in terms of our evaluation is we do look at, let's suppose we only think that this consumer activity shock is going to be a shock for the first quarter and the second quarter, and it's going to restrict consumer activity by maybe 30% relative to its previous kind of trend in consumer activity. Well, under those circumstances, it was the only shock that we observed in economies. It would still be the case that we would need 2% of fiscal effort in order to have positive rates of growth in the global economy for 2020. Now, of course, we think that the consumer activity is, shock to consumer activity is much, much larger. As I say, we already know what's happened to cross-border tourism. We already know what's happened at the domestic level in a lot of countries when we look at things like restaurant usage and entertainment. It's all shut down in New York anyway. We can look at travel in terms of congestion on roads. These are sort of the things that we can look at to gauge how costly these approaches to consumer restrictions are, the social distancing and other restrictions. And we have a story and a set of shocks to the consumer, to the business investment through uncertainty, to financial markets, which we're reading every day, and to the oil market. And we add that up, and we end up with historic declines in global economic activity for the world for 2020. So that puts into place where we are seeing we are seeing a tremendous amount of fiscal support around the world. The question is it enough? And does it come soon enough? And is it targeted enough? And those are all very challenging things: size, timing, and targeting. That we can change the trajectory of the global economy. Our best scenario, frankly, is a very big fiscal effort that has a lot of support. That the virus is kind of dissipated or under control by the middle of the second quarter. And even under those scenarios, we end up with the global growth rate in 2020 to be worse than the global financial crisis.
Right.
So we also and we have to remember, last word is the GFC was the only time since 1960 that the global economy has been in negative territory for a whole year.
And to that point, I mean, it's very much aligned with the scenarios we have at the conference board, is that even a very quick recovery scenario, which will be the most optimistic scenario, aligned with people's view that, some people's view that, cases may begin to level off as of April, we would still end up with a lower level of economic activity compared to the beginning of the year than what we've seen in 2009 after the financial crisis. So, because the economy has just completely crashed, and even if this is a short period of time to get it back up to speed, will take time. Which gets to a poll question that I want to put because, and I asked my colleagues to put it up, because there are different ways of thinking about recovery, and you've been writing about this, Catherine. One is that, yes, we're in a recession. If our guys can put up the poll question, would be great. There are different types of recovery. One is a very deep recession. We'll get a V-shaped type of recovery. So in the third quarter, we'll see a very rapid recovery. It may not make up for the loss, but still it will be very sharp. The second type of recovery is that we're saying that this is going to take longer. This may go spread out over two quarters, and if we get a recovery, it's more like U-shaped. It's sort of only a shallow type of recovery going forward. And then there's a scenario which is kind of L-shaped, and that is that we actually have a permanent loss here. That means that, we will recover, but we're going to recover to a lower level of economic activity, and it will take us, years before we will be back to where we currently are. So I'd like to ask people what they think about those four scenarios. Would you think that once we get through this, we'll very rapidly recover? It will be V. Do you think it will be more like a U? It will take time, but we'll get out of it. Or do you think it could be L, which is really a kind of permanent slowdown? And after we've done that, I'll ask Catherine to comment on that, and then get some comments from the rest of the group, and then we'll move on. So let's close this in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So Catherine, a clear majority here, 56%, saying this is going to be U-shaped. Not very sharp, but more U-shaped. Is that aligned with your analysis?
So I think the answer here depends very intimately on what we think is going to be happening with policy. If there's, and it's going to be different for different countries as well. A country that is very manufacturing intensive is going to have closer to a V than an L. A country that is very tourism intensive is going to have an L, simply because that is not going to come back. Tourists are, So if we add it up kind of around the whole world, you do end up with a U. But the depth and then the recovery depends intimately on how effective and how soon fiscal policy is implemented. The longer it takes to get the money out and deployed, fiscal policy deployed, the deeper the recession will be. And the deeper the recession is, the more fiscal policy you need in order to get out. So this is why our sort of thought process is you have to spend a lot of money, otherwise you're just not going to get and you have to deploy now, otherwise you're going to be in a deep hole. You're going to have a lot of wreckage, meaning unemployed people with bad balance sheets, bankrupt businesses who aren't going to open their doors, and you will not have a spending capability in the second and third quarters and into 2021 if you do have a tremendous amount of damage now. As I say, we learned that in the global financial crisis. We learned it after the European sovereign debt crisis, that fiscal policy, even when you have monetary policy running full out in an effort to support the economy, if you do not have complementary fiscal policy, then you cannot see a strong recovery. So I think I'm concerned that Europe in particular is still squabbling about the size and how much coordinated effort they're going to have, even though their monetary policy is really out there doing as much as it can. I'm concerned that a European policy collectively is not going to come in time. They may have a less deep recession there because they have better social safety nets, but I worry about the strength of any recovery going forward. Our colleagues on the European team do see both a deep recession in European terms and not much of a recovery. The U.S. Fiscal plan has a little bit more oomph to it in percentage terms, and for sure, the characteristics of it, we're still learning more about that.
Yeah. So this L-shaped scenario, I want to open up to the rest of the panel, and guys, you can close the poll here so we can get the full screen back. This L-shape would suggest there's a bunch of other crises coming behind this. So I'd like to I asked the panel a little bit, what are sort of possible second-order effects that we should think about? And we're talking about a recession and a recovery, but what else could this deliver us that could actually put us in this kind of L-shaped scenario? Nick or Steve, any thoughts on this? Go ahead, Nick. Nick, you want to go first?
Okay, well, thank you, Bart. I mean, a couple of things. One is it's interesting, I think, to go beyond US and Europe, because on Sunday, although none of us were really paying attention, the Algerian government cut its budgetary spending by 30%. It's got a savage pro-cyclical downturn in policy. If you have 30 Algerias around the place, then if you look beyond the developed markets, then prospects for the V, it seems to me, are become much more difficult. I think the sort of second order effects is probably going to be around the oil producers and oil demand and oil pricing and demand generally, and the knock-on effects that can have through particularly Middle East and some of the other producing regions.
So that's in the commodity and energy markets. Steve, what are your sort of second order effects? Are you concerned about debt and financial crisis? And well, it's already a financial crisis, but how will this evolve?
Yeah, and Bart, there's a lot of questions on here as to really what's the conference board's forecast. I think, what you've done is you've put up 3 different scenarios. I think the question is what should be the planning scenario, and I think the planning scenario depends on what industry you're in. I think most people think in business it's going to be a U-shaped recovery, that we will get through this, the sun will come out tomorrow and all of that, but the question is at what speed. So the secondary effects are really important here. Biggest thing is, when are we going to go back to work? When do we turn the economy on, and what are the decision rules around that? And the administration here in the U.S. is talking about going back in a couple of weeks, but then you have the trade-off of the number of people that could potentially be impacted by that if then re-exposed. And so there are some ethical questions here that need to be raised and debated over the next couple of weeks. It's very dependent on that decision. When do you go back? And these are things that are handled locally, in most cases, by state and local governments, and internationally by country governments and state governments there. So those are really some knock-on effects. The effect on liquidity. In the financial crisis, we saw all the BBB- debt get downgraded overnight to junk. They lost all their facilities and so forth. We saw hundreds and hundreds of corporate bankruptcies. So can we stave off the rating agencies' downgrades of all of these? And what are going to be the policy on that? And so forth. So there's a lot of the different knock-on effects that could happen here, as Catherine was saying, that could trigger a much deeper economic crisis. But you could make a case that if deftly handled from a policy perspective, we could get through this fairly quickly, and then hope for the herd immunity that would carry us through the rest of the year.
So, Catherine, we need to wrap up this section, Catherine, but I wanted to, there are a lot of questions, by the way. We can't answer them all, but people feel free also to answer these other questions. Some are very specific. But one question is actually on debt, corporate debt as well as government debt. Can you spend just 1 minute on, obviously we're now pulling everything out we can do to fight this, but once we get through this, isn't the debt situation going to be considerably worse, and how are we going to handle that?
So this is a very important question for sure. There's quite a bit of monetary policy firepower being implemented in the United States, both directly in Fed balance sheet, but also in conjunction with the Treasury being proposed to buy just about everything, right? So in the near term, why they're doing it. It's to prevent exactly the kind of cascading through the financial system that ended up with the GFC, the global financial crisis. And we don't want to repeat that. This starts with COVID. You don't want to have GFC on top of that to have to deal with. So we know why the Fed, in conjunction with the Treasury, is implementing this policy. I do worry about the fact that there's now a policy put on the entire portfolio of assets, practically everything. Used to be a policy put on the Treasuries. Now it's a policy put on everything. What this means is that, and I would argue that there were a lot of spreads out there that were extremely narrow. There was no risk priced into the system, and so in some sense we were just waiting for the accident to happen. Now it's happened. It's happened in such a big way that the Fed has had to come back in and put the policy put on everybody's portfolio, no matter what you own, practically. So what this does is it sets it up extremely difficult situation going forward for any type of monetary policy normalization, because that once again will create tremors in the debt market. Now, so there's a short-term exigency where they have to do what they're doing in order to prevent a financial crisis. How do you move forward and get people on a more sustainable debt trajectory? I mean, that's what we have to think about going forward. First, you are not on a sustainable debt trajectory if the economy is either contracting or growing very, very slowly. So, there's already a problem in that, given a slow growth trajectory, which might be an outcome of not doing anything today, you end up on an unsustainable trajectory anyway. So what we're betting, on here, you're betting the farm here, both the Fed and the size of the fiscal package in the U.S., that you put enough air under the wings of the economy as well, individually as well as at a GDP level, in order to ratify the debt that's being undertaken, both the sovereign debt in the U.S. and of course there's other countries as well, and that the additional debt being created and taken on by corporates will be able to be served because you have, be able to service that debt because you have enough growth going forward. My point is, it's not an either or. There's only one game in town here, actually, because if you don't do what we're doing, you know that they're not going to be able to service the debt anyway.
Great. Thank you. That was a really good comment. And a lot of stuff to talk about and continue the conversation. But Steve, we need to move on to the business implications. And as I said before when I introduced you, you've been through a bunch of these crises. No crisis is the same. I'm sure this one isn't. But nevertheless, what is the script that business leaders would typically use when this kind of thing is happening? I mean, it sounds sometimes from the outside, it sounds like, okay, fire everybody, but obviously that's not probably the best way to run your business. So what is your script, or what is the script that you see many of your colleagues use?
Yeah, and I have led businesses through many of these kinds of crises, including the previous epidemiological crises, as well as 9/11 and financial crisis and so forth. We have to start with our people always from a business perspective, meaning our broader community, our employees, our customers, and make sure that we're doing the right thing for our people. Internally, we've got to make sure that we set up, in this case, safe work environments, and in most areas we've gone to remote work and make sure we're facilitating that, teaching people how to deal with that, dealing with the psychological effects of this, the stress effects, and the fear of the unknown, and deal compassionately with our people on those kinds of things. We also owe it to everybody to stay liquid, and I think in every case liquidity has become front and center to make sure that you have enough cash to pay your bills to survive this thing, and so you have to look at that as a business leader. Externally, you have to keep your eye on government action. Clearly, these policies that are being done globally by governments, but from monetary and fiscal sources are important. When they turn it back on, what kind of constraints people are putting on that, because these will impact various sectors differently. I think the final thing is, I think business leaders need to communicate really frequently with people and to be as transparent as possible. Our employees are very smart. Everybody understands this thing. The information are ubiquitous, and so we've got to be straight with people. We've got to tell everybody the way things are, how we're seeing them, what the possibilities are, and do that frequently because it's a moving situation.
Yeah. Joe, I want to ask you about the role of technology and digital here, because that's a very important part of your role currently, and this is really, I mean, we talk a lot about the risks, but there are also really some opportunities where companies can really make the digital transformation process to work to their benefit. Can you comment a little bit on, how in these kind of crises can companies optimally use technology, and particularly digital technology, in order to keep their businesses going?
Yeah, sure. So I would say the first thing is challenge yourself as a business leader to try to telework. We, as I mentioned, have around 26,000 people, of which perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 are not clinicians. They are office workers. Some of them need access to phone trees. They have they run call centers. They need access to all kinds of applications. Figure out a way to do it at home. It's a really important part of just ordinary business continuity planning. Doing it under these kinds of conditions where you have to sprint, where you can't get access to equipment, where you are jury-rigging things, it's clearly less than ideal. I am pretty amazed at how well my organization has been able to adapt. It requires a lot of compromise, and it requires people learning how to communicate with each other over, as we're doing now, over teleconferencing. And it can be done, and it can be productive, but it is a change in how people do things. Certainly in the healthcare industry, telemedicine is taking on an extraordinary outsized role in everything we're doing. And that's true whether we're triaging somebody in the front of a hospital, whether we're consulting on somebody in a hospital, whether we're reaching into a nursing home, reaching into a jail, reaching into a prison, reaching into any number of other environments where we don't want to expose another person. I think the big picture is we can probably all go a lot further than this than we currently are doing.
Any other thoughts that people have about the role of technology that really can help us in this crisis, Steve or Catherine?
The one thing that I found interesting is usually investment is pro-cyclical. In other words, as the economy collapses, so does investment. But one of the things that we have seen in previous crises and previous downturns is information technology embodied capital, sort of intangible capital, is countercyclical. And it adds up to that looking at the macroeconomic picture. And the story has always been that, the forward-looking companies take on IT-enabled capital and intangible capital in order to create more flexibility for their company. And so that's an essential ingredient in a downturn is how do you be flexible? And IT capital creates that flexibility. And it seems that in the context of Joel and the specific application in the healthcare area, that flexibility is how do you use telemedicine? How do you get your clinicians who are doing sort of call doctoring? That is IT-enabled capital. And that is something that is very much a counter-cyclical type of investment.
Steve, do you think technology helps compared to previous crises?
Yeah, especially the digital technology. But I would say this, that behaviorally, every crisis has created some level of permanent change. Not maybe 100%, but I don't think that it'll ever come back to where it was before. This has been the case in every one of these crises, that these new behaviors that take on, the new technologies that have been introduced, this creates the opportunity for winners and losers. I'm not certain that people will need the same kind of business travel, the same kind of meetings in person that they have before. Newer technologies and ways of interacting, as Joel was saying, I think will become a more permanent part of life. And so therefore these create business opportunities and innovation opportunities. And I think that's the final point, which is innovation is key during this period of time, but it creates innovative opportunities thereafter as well.
Right. I want to gradually move to sort of more the policy political issues. We talked actually already a little bit about the economic policy, but Nick, I want to ask you, sort of going back to this big dilemma that I think is unfortunately a little bit politicized right now, certainly in the United States, and that is this balance between how long do we keep trying to sort of contain this crisis versus we need to get the economy going. And it really, it's obviously, it's just a devilish dilemma that you're dealing with. But I think the question that I would have to you is, how are governments, do you think governments are approaching this in a responsible way, or do you think this is just the nature of thing that you have these, sometimes troublesome debates going on? Well, what's the political dimension behind this kind of discussion and dilemma?
Yeah, I think the problem for policy is that they don't have the luxury of waiting until scientists like Joel can give them all the answers. So they have to move sooner rather than later. That was certainly what you saw in the Chinese case. In terms of the main question that you're asking, Bart, about this trade-off between really locking the virus down to try and stop the spread and flatten the curve as against policy, I think it's interesting to note that this is basically a Chinese-led consensus, right? Because China was the first mover in policy terms on this. There were many different countries that sort of looked at different ideas, but basically the priority that the Chinese set, and then the broad toolkit of policies that many governments, by no means all, but many governments are now following, is one that actually was out of Beijing's book. So sure, there are some very big differences. I mean, South Korea has adopted a rather more sophisticated model, you could say, and has also been very successful. But I think we're in new territory. We're in a gigantic experiment for governance right now, and the testing of whether that priority holds over an extended period is, I think, a very interesting one. I'd say there's a consensus right now that is holding, that simply we must do everything we can to hold back this virus. But I wouldn't say that in every country, if the restrictions were to go on for months and months, whether that's going to hold. And that's one thing I think makes it very interesting. And a second point on that, but I think in terms of technology, disinformation is also something for governments that has been a huge problem, more than any previous pandemic, now you have sort of the idiot cures of the village well going right around the world 3 times before WHO can even get its trousers on. So that seems to be also a big challenge for government. And then I think there's a broader one. I'll stop here because I know you're pushed for time. But right now, that argument that we thought was settled 30 years ago about democracy being the best form of government, that's really on trial right now. The Chinese obviously had a very, very bad start. We know all about that. But right now they're coming out kicking and punching pretty hard. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily going to be that authoritarian states are going to come out best and democracies aren't going to come out well, but I think you're going to see a real mix in terms of the league performance tables at the end of all this. And there might be some surprising placings and some surprising results.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think your point on the disinformation actually is quite important. That's very difficult to manage for governments. It is one thing you want to do as a government leaders is to really have your communication under control, and that is continues to be interrupted by all that kind of disinformation that is happening. I'd like to continue the conversation a little bit in that space, and then we'll begin to wrap up, because you're right that we're sort of get to the end. But we have a poll to really ask people's confidence in policymakers on whether this crisis is being adequately handled. And this is important, because this is what leaders really need to gain this confidence and trust. So what is your confidence level that policymakers will be able to manage this crisis adequately? And I'll then let each of you very briefly respond to that, and then Nick, perhaps you can sort of wrap up with a few of the comments, and I will take a few more questions. Is your confidence very high? You have really no major concern, it's okay. You're somewhat concerned, or you think it's really low, or you don't know. Right, so let's give that sort of 5 more seconds, and then we'll close that poll also. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, yeah. So 55% of you are saying 54 are saying I'm somewhat concerned, and then actually there's another 30% low. So we're not in a good place, frankly, if we look at this. So Catherine, let's start with you. What, in your view, we don't have a lot of time, just 1 minute, what in your view is the most important thing that government should do to gain confidence in a crisis like this?
I think in the European context, they have to come up with a coordinated plan within Europe. In the U.S. context, they have to pass this bill. It has to have support for the smaller businesses and for the workers. For Latin America, they have to deal with the fact that the energy crisis is really much more of a traction for them, an issue for them. And for Asia, it's a mixed bag, but how China engages with Asia going forward, how much they're going to use it for supply chains, or China is going to be internally motivated. These are the issues that I think are going to play out most over the next 6 months and 18 months.
Joel, what is in your view the most important thing government should do to keep the trust or gain the confidence?
I'd say there's 2 things. First, a clear message around social distancing. None of this ambiguity, none of this hopeful stuff. That's the most important thing. Second thing is supply chain. I will tell you, in our organization, it is a rodeo. It is the Wild West, and we need some centralized control around procurement and distribution.
Yeah. Actually, Steve, I want to play that to you also. I'd like you to answer the question, but there is a question out there, lots of questions, but again, a really good question also about logistical challenges that companies are facing. What actions are being taken to address those, and how can government help to unlock supply chains, to get logistics going and stuff like that?
It's true, and what you see is an interactive, interlocked global supply chain. So we need to get back to pulling down trade barriers, and what they're talking about is relieving, at least temporarily, the tariffs that had put on certain medical supplies and so forth. So I think that's underway, and that would really be good to relieve those barriers. And you see companies finding alternate sources of supply, and the government facilitating that, all of which I think is a positive. Couple other thoughts. Consumer confidence is critically important in order to drive our economy. In most economies, 70% of our economy in the U.S. is the consumer. In order to do that, you have to have a job. As you know more than anyone, Bart, our consumer confidence index is driven by jobs and wages, and so therefore governments play a huge role here in making sure that the minimum number of jobs are involved. From a business standpoint, finally, confidence is not having the old government saying that let's not have a good crisis go to waste. The governments don't overreach on in this period of time and try to take over a private business. Don't try to overmanage the economy, but trust in markets, trust in the in the entrepreneurial spirit, and that businesses will do the right thing. That could create a great amount of trust and confidence.
Yeah. Nick, and in fact, I'm going to ask all of you that just to wrap up, but maybe you can, from the sort of policy political perspective, what is sort of your biggest concern going through this, and what do you think is the biggest opportunity that from a policy and governance perspective?
So biggest concern, I think, is probably around the importance of clear communication, to come back to something that Joel said. And I think testing, there's a lot of even large developed economies that haven't done anything like enough testing as much as WHO, for instance, would like, and I'm residing in one of them right now. In terms of bigger opportunities, I'm frankly a bit more worried about the international response here and whether it is going to be coordinated. I mean, we're talking about big developed economies and doing their own fiscal responses to this, but IMF is largely tapped out at this point. Is the United States going to lead on a major recapitalization of the IMF so it can fight this more generally? What's the position going to be with some of these dollar swap facilities that some states desperately in need of dollars are wanting? Is this ultimately an opportunity for China? We've had a few questions around the place about those who exit early, what are the advantages for them? Well, let me paint you a picture. What if some of the developed East Asian economies come out of this before Europe and the United States does, really? And what happens if it's the Chinese that actually put forward the big aid package to help them out there? What happens if the textbooks of the 21st century say that the Xi Jinping plan did for East Asia what in early 21st century, what the Marshall Plan did for Europe, second half of the 20th.
Right. Okay, each of you 1 minute, because we really have 3 minutes left. So Joel, let's start with you. Your biggest concern at this point in time, that's something you really think needs to be handled, and what is the biggest opportunity that we have ahead of us?
Far and away, it's the healthcare system being overwhelmed. That's the end game. None of us want to see. It is very much in play, and how we suppress this through social distancing, et cetera, is going to dictate how that plays out.
Right. Catherine, biggest concern, biggest opportunity.
The biggest concern is that even after doing all of this fiscal and monetary effort, that the virus is so pervasive that, and both healthcare intensive, but also all of these people who are running around who don't have any symptoms but are still contagious, that this will lead to consumers just staying home, that it will have an extended period where people will be afraid to go out. And even after undertaking all this effort, that there will not be any kind of rebound. That is damaging across the board prospect. The opportunity is that the policymakers will get it right, and they will communicate effectively that they've gotten it right, and that we will have a healthcare response that ratifies what they've done, and we will end up with the rosy scenario.
Steve, business leaders always look at opportunities, so start with the opportunity.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that there needs to be, some acknowledgement that, these kinds of things are really beyond government control. Certainly government response is important, but, these kinds of viruses are going to be with us forever. This is going to become part of the seasonal program and so forth. So then the question is, how fast do we get back to some degree of normal? And that, requires some level of acceptance that that this isn't going to be cured overnight, and that we, and that the cure can't overweigh the disease here. So business leaders are going to look for, sort of a middle of the road kind of path here in terms of let's protect people, but also there's got to be protection on the other side, and we've got to come out with economies that are strong enough to take care of people in every other dimension.
Right. Right. So, first of all, there's so many questions asked here. We had more than 300 people joining us. We don't have 300 questions, but a lot. We will review them carefully, and we can't probably respond them all, but we'll try to sort of hear you. Please go to our dedicated web page, which is on this slide, on issues around this coronavirus that we continuously refresh every day with insights that we get from our members, from our researchers, from our teams, and so on. Let me thank Catherine Mann, Jo Klein, Nicholas Rentman, and Steve Butland, thank you very much for joining us. There's so much to cover. I may have you back. I don't even know what the next topic for Window On is going to be, but I can sort of guess what it will be. It may be the part 3 of this series. So at some point I may call on you again. Great conversation. Hope we added a little bit. Again, I wish everybody well. Feel safe. Be careful out there. And we'll be in touch with you very soon again. My name is Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and I wish you a good day.
Thanks a lot.